Smarties, today we are thrilled to welcome Anya Kamenetz to the podcast to discuss her book, The Stolen Year, How COVID Changed Children's Lives and Where We Go Now. I don't want to give too much away in this intro. I want you guys to listen to this incredibly rich discussion about how remote learning was a force multiplier for inequity, what COVID revealed about our collective values in the United States, and so much more. Anya is a veteran education reporter, and we invite you to check out this book, which we've linked in the show notes, as well as her Substack called The Golden Hour, which we've also linked in the show notes. Let's dig in.
You want to learn faster, but sometimes working harder is just not the answer. You have to learn smarter. The Educational Therapy Podcast.
Hi, Smarties. Welcome to episode 364 of Learn Smarter, the Educational Therapy Podcast. I'm Stephanie Pitts.
And I'm Rachel Kapp.
And today we are really excited, actually, because we have author Anya Kamenetz on with us. And this is going to be a really interesting conversation. Her book is called The Stolen Year, How COVID Changed Children's Lives and Where We Go Now. So welcome, Anya.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited.
We're thrilled to have you. So before we kind of dig into your book, why don't you introduce yourself to our audience? Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do and why you do it.
Sure. I'm a longtime education journalist. I spent 8 years at NPR covering education as a national correspondent, and I'm currently independent. I write for a bunch of different publications, and I write about parenting and mental health on my Substack newsletter, which is called The Golden Hour.
Awesome.
Let's talk a little bit about The Stolen Year, and I'll just be transparent. This was entirely a selfish endeavor on my end to get you on the podcast because I'm like, I just want to talk to her about this, which is the beauty of a podcast.
Great.
COVID comes up in almost every conversation that we have with a family. I'll just tell you where I sort of land, because in my practice, we primarily exclusively work with learners who struggle with executive functioning skills challenges. It's sort of my belief system that these are challenges that would have emerged anyway. And what actually ended up happening is that parents saw different things. They saw what their learners were experiencing. And so if anything, they might have got parent eyes sooner and faster. Mm-hmm. I know there's some overlap in your research as well. Mm-hmm. But before we kind of dig into all that, can you share a little bit about the origin story of your book and how it came about?
Yeah, it's really simple. So I actually had a long background covering specifically education technology. I was really familiar with its usefulness for accessibility and also many of its shortcomings. And so when I was a national education reporter, everything shut down. I had my own 2 kids at home, 3-year-old and 8-year-old at the time, doing Zoom Montessori school, Zoom 3rd grade.
Zoom Montessori school. I'm sorry. That just hit.
Yeah,
okay.
I can't. That's so hard.
You have to hand it to them. And I have a very close relationship actually with the director of my child's Montessori to this day. But all the craziness was happening. But I also had this global long-term perspective from the research. I was intimately familiar with all the ways that remote learning can be a force multiplier for inequities. So some kids do really well. And that includes some kids with disabilities or that learn differently. They can do really well with the right support. Other kids, it is a total disaster. And I also knew a lot about the things that school delivers that cannot be delivered through a screen. And whether that is meals, whether that is in-person mental health support, socialization, obviously. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of had one of those feelings of like Minority Report. Like I could see this coming. This is going to be very, very bad. And even thinking at the time that it might be 6 weeks, that could still be.
Remember how cute?
We thought it was like 2 weeks and then it was like, oh, okay, it's 6 weeks. We can do that.
We're having cocktails here.
Yeah.
Like we were doing all the things. We're like, okay, we're going to bake bread.
Yeah.
Like we're doing all the things that everybody.
We can get through it.
We can do 2 weeks of anything.
So even at that moment, though, I knew that actually it can be, 6 weeks can be a real thing. So I started tracking families, and I was lucky enough to have a book editor that I had worked with before. He was really interested. So I was able to report the book while working at NPR, while also parenting 2 kids, with my husband also working at home. And I don't have a lot of memories of that, as you can imagine.
It's just like trauma. Your brain forgot it.
Yes. So The Stolen Year is this story of 5 families from around the country with various different combinations of challenges, plus huge numbers of interviews with people in all different kinds of circumstances, and just taking in the reality of what this was, what we went through, and then the consequences, which I understand you're seeing every day.
Every day.
So this isn't a question that we have written down, but I'm going to ask the question. What did you predict? How much of it came true? And did any of it shock you?
Wow.
That's a loaded question.
Yeah. So, sorry, 3-part question.
In the very early days of April, I published a story that was basically 9 out of 10 kids are out of school around the world. Now what? I went on Morning Edition and I said, here's what we know, because there are case studies and they're mostly from very different countries from the United States, but there are case studies from the world of an earthquake, an outbreak, Ebola, times when Katrina was one I knew intimately because I was from New Orleans. I had reported on schools both before and after Katrina, and even as up to 10 years later. So I knew that if schools were thrown out of session in a time when there was a lot of upheaval in society, that we were going to see the following things. We would see toxic stress on caregivers that would propagate to kids. We would see a lot of people sort of at the ends of their educational journeys, high school into college, a lot of dislocation. So the time when kids start looking at paid work instead of school, and you see this in a lot of societies where they're trying to get people into school, but it's very hard if a 15-year-old is expected to be supporting their family. We definitely saw that. Mm-hmm. That you would see that there would be massive inequities, right, by race, by class, any kind of other inequity in society that you would see. One prediction that I had was, school systems sometimes are entirely remade in the wake of disasters like this. That was the one I would say that really shocked me because there was such a push to try to get back to business as usual and kind of forget it ever happened. And I don't know what you think. I'm not seeing the kinds of changes and approaches to teaching and learning that you would expect when you're like, okay, you know what? We threw everything out the window. What did we learn here? And what might we do differently if we have different priorities now and different desires now?
Yeah, I think in terms of that, I agree that there was such a pushback to we just wanted to feel normal.
Yeah.
And how do you develop best practices out of this collective trauma? I mean, everything moves so slow in education. What I did see is maybe from parents, more of an understanding of sort of the demands on their kids and the demands in terms of that our kids are actually functioning at a much higher, more demanding level than honestly we are a lot of the time. We go to work, we have one job. Mm-hmm. They have 7 bosses and there are 7 different teachers in middle school. So I saw that sort of shift emerge. But no, in terms of systemic overhaul, how are we going to take what was actually good and use that? I haven't seen that, but I wonder if the research isn't there yet, or those aren't the questions that we were asking either.
It's a very good point. The school-home relationship changed and expectations changed. The visibility of parents into the classroom changed a lot. And I think that has a long tail. I believe in that. And I believe that fundamentally can be very good. And just in terms of students understanding what it is that they need in order to succeed, I think there is more awareness, at least on the part of students that have the right support systems to get it.
Yeah.
I was going to say the things that I saw, number one, parents and students more willing to get support. That definitely came from it. But on the school systemic teacher side, at first it was very much, for a little while, the kids weren't where their peers were prior to COVID. However, I think that over time we sort of forgot that is what's actually where they're coming from, and they are behind their peers, but our expectations have stayed the same. Mm-hmm. And more kids are not meeting those other expectations that their peers before them were able to meet. And I think that is something very crucial in the way that things are being asked of these kids, things are getting graded, and things are just in general what we're expecting of them can't be the same. But yet, as time has gone by, it's been, sort of a look the other way, that some of the kids at certain ages in particular, we're seeing trends, at least I'm seeing trends of this is where they're struggling because they didn't get that at that time in their lives. And it's all different sort of by grouping, like the kids in high school, where they were when COVID happened, basically.
Yeah, I think that's so well put. And, you have this shifting baseline syndrome, right, where people forget. Parents don't really know where their kids are supposed to be at. The school is structured so differently. And then maybe even teachers are coming into the profession and didn't have that pre-COVID knowledge, or it's vaguer than it used to be. I mean, to me, it's a huge missed opportunity because we did have an opportunity to kind of reorganize school around priorities that are very meaningful. And I think that a lot of times teachers feel caught between sort of like their definition of rigor and high expectations versus being aware of kids' mental health needs and not wanting to overly stress them. But, I always want to point out that there's a middle path in the sense that, warm demanding and high expectations that are based on the idea that actually challenge is good for kids. It's part of their psychological needs, but they have to be meaningful goals and they can't be these outside imposed, standardized, same for every single kid, which is how we define it in this era of multiple choice tests. So,
so rough. Yeah.
Yeah. I just find it to be like a real bummer.
Maybe we'll catch up, but we'll see.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about what else shocked you in your research or surprised you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say that what's shocking is obviously from a policy perspective. I did a deep dive into the kinds of policies that support children. And it obviously doesn't begin and end with school. We have a really high child poverty rate in the US, and it is based on a lack of a social safety net, right? We don't have paid family leave. We don't have child income support. And so one of the most shocking things to see, honestly, was providing a child tax credit, watching that money go into the pockets of families that I had profiled and watching it make a difference, and then seeing it taken away because we decided that we didn't need to do that anymore. So yeah, I find that really shocking. And I think that, there's a conversation people are having now about family size in the US and who's having kids and who aren't. And it's like, if you don't support people and they have no way to have a family, then obviously you're not going to get big families in the US. It just seems really simple to me.
Seems like a responsible decision that we've left to people with the way that our social safety net is set up.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And now we're having a conversation about Medicaid. And I just recently did a story about threats to Head Start. And it's like the little tiny pieces that are getting taken away. So yeah, I guess I do find that shocking. Yeah, when it comes to families and kids, there are still a lot of impacts, even though we're not necessarily talking about COVID front and center anymore. But I think we're still seeing them very much.
So what are some of the big impacts that you noticed in your research and your conversations?
You really see like a wave that moves through the life course of children from 0 to 18. And, a lot of the very early childhood, the language development and your early experiences, that's something that I'm hearing and seeing now from people who work in early childhood today, fascinatingly. So they had, babies that were born in 2020 or in 2021 that are just getting to school, getting to preschool. And I spoke directly with preschool teachers just last year talking about these kids don't know how to share. They have huge language delays. They haven't really been socialized or had the same experiences out of the home or with a school routine. There was like a sort of hangover effect of parents not choosing preschool or choosing some other, pre-kindergarten experience for their kids. And so that's seen, and that's been a big impact. On the other end of the spectrum, of course, you have kids in college, right, or in high school that the older years of their education were interrupted or delayed, and there were certain things they never got back. And I think we're seeing that across the board in reports of depression, anxiety, ADHD, autism, all across the board, whether it's clinical or subclinical or not clinical at all. But you can attribute it to having some of your core developmental experiences just taken from you, right?
This is something that Steffi and I talked about privately last week. I was just thinking about this generation, and particularly we're in LA, and what's happened to these kids who now their homes are gone and their schools are gone because of the fires that wiped everything out. And just like the things that should be stable, going to school, interacting with your peers, your home, the physical building of your school.
Yeah.
Plus the graduations, the missed proms, all those milestones.
Even for me as an adult, who lost the home that I grew up in, lost my elementary school. Obviously, I'm not there anymore, but it has profoundly impacted me. And I'm not a kid.
Mm-hmm. Or living there or in school there.
Right. But like just the past of what was lost feels heavy.
For us, we had pre 9/11, post 9/11.
100%.
That was the big thing that occurred during adolescence for us.
I was in college, but.
Well, okay. I was in middle school, right? And these kids have had one trauma.
It's true.
After another. And depending upon what part of the country, political trauma, all this stuff, these social movements that have come forth during COVID too. It's so much. It's so much.
Well, I love that you took it there. And I'm also very sorry to hear about what you lost stuff. But the COVID writing experience led me directly to what I'm doing now, which is actually talking about the impact of the climate and political crises on our young people's well-being, because it really is this everything, everywhere, all at once.
Mm-hmm. It really feels like that. It honestly does.
It's real. It feels that way because it's real. And also because we're in an information environment that always tilts to the most extreme and the most intense and is addictive and is 24/7 immersive. So you may say like, okay, we're not living in the Black Death in the Middle Ages, but we're also not getting push notifications about the Black Death, right?
Fair enough.
Where it's like somebody else just died of the bubonic plague. Somebody else just died. So like there's been points in our history where humans have faced very tough stuff, but like the fact that I have to reach to that comparison should tell you this is very intense. And it's going to require some really heroic nurturing to bring kids through it in a way that leaves them with their strength intact. And I am so strengths-based. I mean, I'm fundamentally wired to look at the positives and look at young people for their promise and what they bring to the table. And I find them being so adaptive and so resilient.
They are.
But they need a lot of help and they need us to be honest with them.
What do they need us to be honest with them about?
They need to hear that there are serious threats to our way of life, that extreme weather is not a one-off. It's going to keep happening, that we need, I don't know how far you want me to go with this, but scientists are concerned about threats to our country, to our world. They need to know that there are people working on solutions. There are a vast range of solutions out there, and that their lives are going to be partially about adapting and growing. And there is a heroic task of this generation to be sort of the guardians of the future. There's a lot to be said for being alive in this time, and they're going to need skills for that. They're going to need to be the protagonists here. They need to be grounded in civic action and community action, and they need to be relationally really, really skilled, and I think that's what professionals like yourself and what many schools, many therapists are working with kids on, that they are so emotionally intelligent. They do have so many resources. They're going to need them.
I'm feeling overwhelmed. I have young kids as well. There's such a tendency when you're in the trenches of parenting to just take the next thing. So looking at this global, and this is like a conversation that we have ongoing as parents, my husband and I, because he'll look at things globally. I'm like, I can only focus on the four walls of this house and control what's happening in the four walls of this house, and then not even all the time.
Yeah.
And so to be attuned to both at the same time is so exhausting. In your book, you talk about COVID not causing this child crisis, but rather just exposing it. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Sure, absolutely. But I'm going to respond to what you said too.
Please.
It's so important. And it is up to none of us to do this all ourselves, right? We have really cast parenthood as this like nuclear atomized endeavor. And like, we have to do this in community, and we take turns carrying it. So I just want to like affirm that nobody's succeeding at all of this all the time. When it comes to exposing the child crisis, I'm really talking about America being the country that supports children the least and has an unconscionable percentage of poor kids, and has just never been. And I think for a lot of reasons that have to do with how we were founded and the racial and ethnic makeup of older generations versus younger generations, that it's been very difficult to have equity and have communal support for our families and for our kids. And so, yeah, I mean, that's where something like this comes and you can kind of show, it exposes the fault lines. It shows where things were kind of set up to fail.
Going back to the things that were set up to fail, that those got exposed, but maybe we're trying to pivot a little bit, but not really. Or it almost feels like we say we're pivoting, but we're not really pivoting. And where we really need to look and go, because schools in particular, if we're talking about that, it's providing, as we talked about, the social, the emotional, the academic, the meals, mental health stuff, safety, a place to go, a place to grow, a place to learn, those kinds of things. And not only just the gap that we didn't have that for so long, but I'm wondering, in your research, have you found that now that we are coming out the other side, is it, I mean, I would assume, but I'm going to ask the question, is it needed more and now we can't support it really at all still because it's too big of a thing?
The thing about a systemic disaster like COVID is that, as we saw, like the stress was propagated throughout the system, right? So I had not only people that I reported with, but friends at different levels, from superintendent to principal to administrator to teacher to aide, right? And they were all stressed out, right? They were all burnt out. They were all pushed to their limits.
It's true.
There's media conversations about, oh, parents versus teachers. It's like, a lot of your teachers are parents.
100%.
And they're getting it from both sides. And so then as we started to come out of it, people were faced with this dilemma of like, well, I want to add more instructional time. I might even have federal money to add more instructional time, but my teachers are not having it. They're not signing up for extra hours in the day because they are tired. And another thing, I've heard this from all levels, from preschool to college, everybody's taking all their sick days. Everybody's taking all their vacation days. And like, that's great. They should, and they're aware of their own burnout, but also the system's not set up for everybody to take all their days.
It's true.
Wow. Such a simple thing. And the kind of ricochet impact. Can I ask a question I don't think there's a answer to? I think it would depend on metrics, but was one age group, let's just keep it stuck to kids.
Yeah.
Was one age group affected worse than others?
People will have different takes on this. I think that you'll hear, like I said, it's easy to see the impacts on the high school to college transition, especially for those couple of years, right? Literally not being able to take the SATs in person and having to start college in your bedroom. That was not great for anybody. So I think those couple of years, the early years, and I look at the 0 to 5 age group as well as being critical in certain ways. You would hear parents say, well, I'm happy because they just want to hang out with us anyway as toddlers, but then they might have missed out on that socialization at a certain critical point. I've heard a lot of stuff about the middle school years, the transition into middle school years, the 4th, 5th, 6th graders. Maybe they're getting out of high school now, where they were supposed to be separating from their parents and spending more time with peers, and they weren't able to do that. And there's so much that goes on developmentally in those years with your self-image, with yourself in a group, with your self-identity that they maybe weren't able to do. I'm looking at that. I mean, what are you seeing?
Reading as well.
Oh, yeah.
The ones that you talked about, but reading as well.
So early reading.
Yeah. So I think that, like you said, there's that age group with the transition to college, to job, to all of that. There's the middle school learning independence.
And the parent transitioning from being the manager to being the consultant.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That was affected. And then I think the kids that didn't get some of the intensive reading support that they needed, that are now feeling, okay, you know, once they get to a certain point, it's very hard to teach them how to do some of the reading things. Like their brain just doesn't do it.
But it's also because the demand on them is so far beyond their ability to decode.
Yeah.
Right. But I guess my point being, as an age group, the ability to learn to decode as you're older becomes harder and harder, right?
Yeah.
So now it starts to become adaptable strategies rather than actually teaching the decoding because it's very hard to teach it when they're older. Every group has its own challenge. Like being a COVID kid is just a challenge in itself.
Yeah.
Honestly. And just whatever age group you were in, but like very affected.
You're so right about the reading. And I didn't address my question as much to the learning. I think that I would also put in a word for kids who came back to school and had to deal with everybody else's issues. So there were a lot of schools that kind of like fell apart behaviorally in the transition back to COVID. And we heard about this a lot. And so there were kids that weren't as vocal with their problems, but they might have gone under the radar because there was so much triage going on.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's true.
What did our response to COVID illuminate about our values in those countries?
Oh my God. I mean,
that's a loaded question. Yeah.
It's a loaded question.
It's a really intense question. And it's the one I probably wrestle with the most because I just saw that we didn't put our kids first. I'm going to lay it equally at blue states and red states, even though they took very different approaches to the pandemic. But, when you saw cities that had open dog parks and closed playgrounds or open bars and restaurants and closed schools, it's like, how do you say with a straight face that you're honoring what families need or what kids need in that situation? Like a hybrid school schedule where like parents are working and the kids are in school every other week for 3 hours. It just, it didn't put families first. I'll just say that.
What would it have looked like? If you could have taken your magic wand, what would our collective experience in COVID have looked like? How would it have been different?
Germany and France reopened their schools in the fall of 2020, and they kept them open with very few changes. And if they needed to, so Germany had a surge in the winter of 2020, they closed their Christmas markets, they closed their bars, they closed other things preferentially so that they could keep schools open and keep the risk low. In Germany, there was a hotline you could call if you were feeling overwhelmed. I mean, they always have this, but it was advertised everywhere. So everybody knew, parents, if you're home with your kids and you're having a stress moment, please call. We're here. We're not going to judge you. We're not going to take your kids away, because parents needed that support. So these are the kinds of things where, what did we add extra for kids? What did we do to actually supplement caregivers' needs? And when did we ever prioritize the kids and their needs?
I didn't realize that about Germany.
Me either.
I knew that different countries did different things.
How did Scandinavia handle it, out of curiosity?
So Sweden was famous for barely closing their schools at all.
That I knew, yeah.
They were on an extreme end, but Northern Europe in general and Spain and pretty much the majority of Europe followed this rule of like, they had just completely different recommendations. They said, we don't think kids are that contagious. We don't think that they get that sick. Many countries in Europe didn't even mandate masking under 10 years old. They were like, we don't think the kids can wear the masks that well, and we don't think that it helps, but we can see that it's like annoying for them and that it interferes with talking and listening.
And the impact isn't that great.
Yeah, for the benefit versus the cost, right?
Right.
So France, I recall, they had a public conversation with a lot of buy-in from the teacher unions about reopening. They just had a lot of agreement between the teacher unions and people in general about the necessity of keeping schools open. It didn't get as polarized. I mean, there's a vast number of different conversations we could have about the decisions that we made and why we made them. But the thing I just want to focus on is that you saw a clear intention in Europe, across Europe, to prioritize schools reopening. And even in countries like South Korea was a country that was, and Japan, they were both very cautious about COVID, not as cautious as China, but they had previous experiences. They still prioritize school reopening. And so when you look country by country, we are a real outlier in terms of a wealthy country that closed our schools for a very long time. A lot of poor countries, Uganda, Mexico, Kenya, they closed their schools for like a year plus. A lot of it had to do with the economic hit that the countries took because of COVID. So in terms of a country that was wealthy and had resources, we had a shocking number of kids out of school for a very, very long time.
Especially in LA, we had a very, very long time.
Yes.
It was a year and a half.
Yeah.
And even then it was still hybrid.
Like we weren't sure what was going to happen and kids could decide and yeah.
Yeah. There's a new book out about it called Abundance of Caution that looks at, what was the science that we based our recommendations on? And you guys might have opinions about this, but like in the United States, we have a very intense concern for kids' safety, right? And that has really good things like, okay, putting everybody on their back to sleep and trying to avoid co-sleeping, or like making sure we have great standards for car seats. And then there are things like not letting your kid walk down the street, not letting them play in the park. The police will be called if your 7-year-old goes to buy a popsicle. The safety-ism, where it seems to be for our kids' best interest, but it's not actually developmentally. And it seemed like it was a safety-ism thing where it was like, Well, I mean, obviously, nobody wants one single kid to get sick. Nobody wants one single grandparent to get sick.
For sure.
We did not have the power over this virus that we wanted to have. But in terms of the evidence that we had on both sides of the ledger about what we could have done, should have done, and how to balance those in an imperfect world, that's the conversation we need to be having now.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So, do you believe that the lessons that we have learned from your book, which are something that we're going to have to grapple with as a nation, as the research comes out, because we're not done seeing the impact. I'm not sure when history will decide that we've come out of it, but are we just moving on without fixing things or fixing what was exposed? Are we making positive steps in the right direction? What are you seeing?
So I think that the success of folks like you and the work that you do is a sign of recovery in the best way, in the sense that you have to have an awareness of what's going wrong before you seek out the solutions to make it better. I would pat yourselves on the back, and everybody who's listening to this podcast, you are caring so deeply about our kids reaching their full potential, right? That's what this is about. The work that helped me as I was trying to figure out where we land this plane was in the science of what's called post-traumatic growth. So, I don't know if you guys are familiar with that term.
No.
Great. So when we talk about resilience, it's connoting bouncing back, right? You're walking on the grass and the grass bounces right back, right, to where it was. And there's no mark on it. But that's not always realistic. Sometimes there's a real impact. There is harm. And what we see with post-traumatic growth, it was we see like a tree that is battling the wind, and it's creating what's called heartwood. The strongest wood of the tree comes from the wind that it battles, right? The forces that it is shaped by. And post-traumatic growth is the growth that you experience in relationship to a harm. It's reported by up to 2/3 of people who have been through even the worst possible things you can imagine, including things like fires. I interviewed a woman recently who went through the Marshall Fire in Colorado, and they experience and report improvements in their outlook, in their optimism, their gratitude, their relationships being stronger, self-confidence in their own strength, a sense of new possibilities opening up in their lives. And these are things that we can actually foster in our kids. We can help them see that the things that they went through are the things that make them the strongest. And we can have a lot of empathy that we share with our kids, that our kids share with others, because we see we've had a difficult experience and we've come back from it. And that's the paradigm that I really reach for when I think about how can I raise my kids to have the best lives that they can have in the face of very real stuff that's going on.
It's so true. One of the things that we talk about in educational therapy is the metacognition of learning about learning.
Yeah.
And having that perspective of what worked, what didn't work, what do you want to try to get to, or how do you want to do it differently? And the growth aspect of what we teach in educational therapy is how to hold yourselves up, how to have kids hold themselves up.
Yeah.
And it looks a little different post-COVID. I'm saying post-COVID with quotes, Rach. A lot of the kids are still learning and figuring it out. I mean, I'm constantly processing with the kids about expectations or how things change all of a sudden. They used to be able to do it this way, and now all of a sudden they can't do it this way. And it's coming up a lot for a lot of them, or they remember when conversations. And so I think highlighting that and just being thoughtful for all of that. I definitely think about you saying the traumatic growth of there's definitely things in all of our lives that I'm sitting here thinking about, knowing that, oh yeah, that definitely changed my perspective on a lot of things.
Yeah.
And how can we continue to foster it? Because we can't prevent these things, but how can we foster the growth afterwards is important.
Yeah. When you think about people that really have to have strategies in order to learn, like I was one of those kids who was gifted and wasn't challenged and coasted through without ever having to work that hard, and like made me very brittle and not necessarily have the strategies that I needed. And I grew to really appreciate the kids that I knew that had been through that kind of experience, whether it was overcoming dyslexia or, you know, different kind of attention challenges, because they had the grit and they knew how to do something hard.
The easiest way to describe it is the kids that can do math in their head.
Yeah.
Until all of a sudden it gets too complicated and they can't do it anymore. And they don't have the grit to be able to explain their thought process on paper. And so that is 100% what, looking at it globally of what COVID created and what COVID has sort of taught us and what we can continue to teach. I think, all very important lessons to sit there and think about now. So I appreciate you having this book to just, have us sit back and reflect. I think it's important. We always talk about how on the podcast, it helps us figure out what we think.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important to spend some more time reflecting. It's going to make me spend some more time reflecting about it.
Thank you. I guess I feel like it's also important to think about the ways in which COVID was an opportunity in a weird way. I mean, it was in some ways a precursor to disruptions that we're going to continue to see at different scales, right? In different places, maybe not at this scale, because this was a truly global, unprecedented scale, but times when the tables flipped, right? Times when the fire's coming down the mountain, you have to leave your house. And I always compare it to, okay, you run out of your house, look down at your hands. What are you holding on to? That's what's most important to you.
It's 100% true. Yeah.
Well, I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I would love for you to come back on the podcast to discuss the test too, because I think that's another one that's right in our wheelhouse of conversation. So I would love to get that scheduled with you as well. But
sure.
What do you want to leave our audience with? Is there a call to action? Is there something? There's a lot of educators who listen to this podcast, and a lot of them are parents, and there are a lot of parents who aren't educators listening. What do you sort of leave them with?
I hope you'll check out my Substack, The Golden Hour, and join the conversation there, because I really try to address the well-being of parents and caregivers as well as the well-being of children, because I really do believe that it's all super connected. And the act of facing hard truths and hard realities or hard possibilities is something that has the potential to always make us stronger. So I just really applaud you guys for taking this on, and I appreciate the conversation very much.
So do we.
Us too. Thank you so much for your work, Anya.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Have a great week, Smarties.
Have a great week.
Have a great week.